Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel where we learn Ruby and Rails together. In today's video, we are going to do some metaprogramming. Specifically, we are going to learn how the class eval and instance eval methods work and how they behave differently when called on a class versus an instance. So let's begin. Here I have a class greeting that has a single constructor that takes a string text and it assigns it to an instance variable with the same name. And I have created a eval test. We're going to use mini test for this, and we're going to add a bunch of tests to see the behavior of these methods. So I have created an eval test, and we're going to test different combinations of these methods, whether they are called on class or an instance. So first we have class eval, and we'll see what happens when you call it on a class. So class eval, what it does is, given if you pass a block or a string of code, it evaluates that block or string in the context of the class. So let's start. We have the greeting class, and we'll call class eval on that, and we'll define a method here called greet, and we'll simply return some text. And here Ruby will take this block of code and it will evaluate in the context of greeting class. So this is similar to just adding this method below here. And what we're doing here is simply reopening an existing class and defining additional behavior on that class. So all the instances of greeting get this method. So let's create an instance. And we'll assert that greeting1 has a method called greet, and it returns hello world. And I forgot to wrap the code in a test method, so let's do that. All right, so let's run the test. And the test passed. So that means we successfully added the greet method on greeting that returns hello world. And you can also access the instance variables of that class. So here we have an instance variable text, which was assigned to text that we passed to the constructor. That is, when we created the instance of greeting, we passed Akshay, and so Akshay gets passed to this text, and we can access that inside our class eval. So let's return that too. And we'll add that to our test and let's run our test again, and that passed. And that's the power Ruby gives you. So usually in other programming languages that are more strict, you cannot access the instance variables of a class outside that class without accessing the object of that, without going through an object of that class. But here we're just opening the class, adding extra methods on that, and we are also accessing the instance variable on that class. And this method is this method gets added to all instances of that class. So if I create another instance, it also has that greet method, and the test passed again. And you can also pass a string to class eval, so you can do let's define our string. Here. So if you haven't seen this syntax, it just defines a string. This is here doc, and it just defines a string with the EOF as delimiter. So string code is this string, and we are passing that string to greeting.classEval. And now we can make an assertion that our greeting instance has a aloha method, and that returns this is an instance method. So let's first create the greeting3 instance. And let's run the test, and that passed. So just to reiterate, class eval executes a code or a block of code in the context of the class, and it basically reopens and defines additional behavior on that class. You can pass a block or a string. Moving on, the next combination is what happens when you call class eval on an instance. So let's create a method for that. And the simple answer is you can't call class eval on an instance. You can only call class eval on a class. So if we call class eval on an instance, Ruby will throw an error called no method error, because no such method exists on that instance. So let's create our instance, and we'll use the assert raises test method helper, and we'll test that it throws no method error. And in here we'll try to call greeting1 dot class eval, and we'll pass an empty block to it, and let's run our test. And the test passed. If you just want to see whether it fails if I don't wrap it in the test, and let's run the test again. You can see it failed, and we got an error, no method error, and undefined method class eval for that instance. All right, let's run the test again, and it passed. Next is instance eval, and again instance eval does act similarly. So basically it evaluates this block of code or a string in the context of the receiving object. So let's create our test method, class instance eval, and we'll call class eval instance eval on the greeting class. And we'll just again define another method on that. So again, instance eval executes the code in the context of the receiving object, and in here the receiving object is greeting. Now greeting is, even though it is a class, it is also an object, because all classes in Ruby are objects, and greeting is an instance of class. So just to prove that point, let's open IRB, and let's create a class temp, and if we call temp dot class, Ruby returns class. So class is a special class in Ruby, and temp is an object of class. So when you call greeting.instance eval, Ruby will try to execute this code in the context of this object, which is an object of class. and it defines this method on this object. And what that will do is define a class method on greeting class. So it won't create an instance method, but a class method, because it added this method to that specific instance of class, which is greeting. I know it's confusing, but just remember that when you call instance eval on a class, it adds class methods. So let's assert that so you can call welcome on the greeting with the capital G. So we're calling welcome on the class here. So let's run the test, and it passed. And we'll make sure the welcome was not added to the instance method. So let's create greeting1 equals greeting.new. Oops. And we'll assert raises, no method error, and let's call greeting1.welcome. And we're just asserting that calling welcome on an instance raises no method error, because the welcome method was added to the greeting class. All right. The final combination is calling instance eval on an instance. So let's create our method. And I will create an instance of greeting. And what we'll do is call instance eval on this instance. So I'm adding personal greeting method to this instance called greeting1. And let's return specific to greeting1. All right. So again, instance eval executes a block of code in the context of the receiving object, which is greeting1. And what it does is adds this method to the greeting1 object. And if we do assert equal, let's pass the same string, greeting1 dot, and the method we added was personal greeting. And let's run the test. It passed. So basically what we did was to add a personal greeting to greeting1 instance. And so basically here we added this method to only this instance, so no other instance of greeting gets this method. So we can test this using, so let's create a new instance called greeting2, and let's call greeting2 dot personal greeting, which does not exist. So if we run this, we'll get an error, no method error, and undefined method personal greeting for this instance. And let's just wrap it in our assert raises no method error block. So our test passes. All right, so that passed. So just to summarize, class eval evaluates a block of code or a string of code in the context of the class, and you can use it to open an existing class and define additional behavior on that class. Instance eval executes the code in the context of the receiving object, and when you add that to a class, it defines class methods. And if you call instance eval on an instance, it just adds those methods on that particular instance, and no other instances get that behavior. I hope that was useful. If you have any feedback, please let me know in the comments. I look forward to it. Thanks for watching.